I'm going to read you my presentation for the Tuesday Women's Association at the Ethical Society, which was on love according to bell hooks. First, I want to clarify that the presentation isn't 100% expository. At times, I give my own examples and arguments to show that Hook's book is as relevant today as ever. So let's start. What is love? We tend to think of love as a feeling. Some philosophers define love as a neurochemical state. They say that when you love someone, your brain releases dopamine, norepinephrine, oxytocin, and serotonin. These chemicals make you feel giddy, energetic, euphoric, and anxious. You don't choose to experience these brain states. They just happen to you. This is what we mean by falling in love. You don't choose to love someone, your brain does it to you. Other philosophers define love as a social construct. They say that the definition of love changes from one place to the next. In some cultures, love is epitomized in a romantic pair bond between a man and a woman. In others, love is between one man and many women. Some societies value romantic love over familial love, while others favor filial piety. Social constructionists take cultural definitions at face value, even if they are sexist and homophobic. Some people say that love is subjective. It can mean anything to anybody. We shouldn't question anyone's definition of love because everyone is free to create their own meaning. Bell Hooks rejects these definitions. She denies that love is a feeling. She says love is a choice, an intention, an action. Love is not something that happens to us or something that happens in our brains. It's something that we choose to do and something that we can choose not to do. How many of us grew up in homes characterized by abuse and neglect? How many of us were hit or humiliated or ignored as children by our caregivers, the people who were supposed to love us? According to Bell Hooks, an overwhelming majority of us come from dysfunctional families in which we were taught we were not okay, where we were shamed, verbally and or physically abused, and emotionally neglected even as we were also taught to believe that we were loved. For most folks, it is just too threatening to embrace a definition of love that would no longer enable us to see love as present in our families. Too many of us need to cling to a notion of love that either makes abuse acceptable or at least makes it seem that whatever happened was not that bad. People who abuse and neglect their children may feel love for them. Their brains may release oxytocin and dopamine when they interact with their offspring, but do they love their children? Bell Hooks says no. Love and abuse cannot coexist. Abuse and neglect are, by definition, the opposites of nurturance and care. To believe that parents who abuse and neglect their children also love them involves a contradiction. Abuse is the opposite of love. It negates love. Hooks also denies that cultures define love. Love does not vary from one place to the next. It's the same everywhere. It's not the case that in certain cultures, love is only between a man and a woman, just because homophobic and sexist policymakers have defined it that way. Homophobia and sexism are forms of abuse, and therefore cannot be used to define love. Cultures that do not recognize same-sex love are unloving, and they should change their definitions. Hooks also denies that people can make up their own definition of love. Some parents believe that hitting their children is a way of expressing love. Some women believe that being quietly submissive to their husband is a loving gesture. These are forms of abuse and subordination, not love. Why would we accept that people can define love on their own terms? Hooks says, undoubtedly, many of us are more comfortable with the notion that love can mean anything to anybody precisely because when we define it with precision and clarity, it brings us face to face with our lacks, with terrible alienation. The truth is, far too many people in our culture do not know what love is. We refuse to give love a clear and objective definition because we worry that if we do, We'll have to admit that some of our most important relationships have been unloving and have not provided us with a model that we can use to understand and find love. In contrast to scientific, social, and subjective definitions of love, which merely try to describe the phenomenon, Hooks offers a prescriptive definition, one that tells us how we ought to love. She doesn't try to describe love as it actually is, because she believes that most people are bad at giving and receiving love. This is because most of us grew up in unloving environments, which taught us that love is compatible with violence, sexism, racism, homophobia, fat shaming, and other types of abuse. We need a definition of love that will help us repair our relationships and fix our culture, not one that maintains the status quo and convinces us to stay in abusive relationships. Hooks' definition of love has 7 ingredients: care, affection, recognition, respect, commitment, and trust, as well as open and honest communication. Every type of love in every place has these 7 components. Whether it's between romantic partners or families or friends or community members, genuine love necessarily has these 7 dimensions. Now, Bell Hooks thinks that this type of love is very hard to find in our society. Why is this? I'm going to discuss 2 reasons that she cites. The first is injustice. When you're raised to believe that love is a feeling or a cultural norm or just whatever you please, you don't think about the relationship between love and justice. But on Hooks' definition, there can be no love without justice. Once we start thinking of justice as a precondition of love, we start to see that love is lacking in the places where we might most expect to find it. One example is the family. Hooks explains how her own family of origin failed to love her. In early adolescence, when we were whipped and told that these punishments were for our own good, or I'm doing this because I love you, my siblings and I were confused. Why was harsh punishment a gesture of love? As children do, we pretended to accept this grown-up logic, but we knew in our hearts it was not right. Children are often told that families love them, even if their families are abusive, and this distorts their understanding of love and makes them vulnerable to abuse in the future. Hooks explains that many of her romantic relationships were abusive because she had been taught to accept abuse as a child. The injustices that we experience as children make it harder for us to find love as adults. Neglect can be just as detrimental as abuse. On the flip side, there are masses of children who grow up confident love is a good feeling, who are never punished, who are allowed to believe that love is only about getting your needs met, your desires satisfied. In their child's minds, love is not about what they have to give. Love is mostly something given to them. When children like these are overindulged, either materially or by being allowed to act out, this is a form of neglect. When we are taught that love is equivalent to receiving gifts and privileges, we never learn to value the other aspects of love: affection, recognition, respect, trust. We begin to see love as a commodity that can be bought and sold, instead of a relationship that takes time and effort to cultivate. When relationships revolve around money and power, they are alienating and lonely. Families are where we learn about love, and they're terrible teachers. Since the family is such a revered social institution, many of us do not realize it is the main site of trauma and violence in our society. Hooks writes, "In our culture, the private family dwelling is the one institutionalized sphere of power that can easily be autocratic and fascistic. As absolute rulers, parents can usually decide without any intervention what is best for their children. Abuse that would be illegal in any other context is accepted and normalized in families." Hooks explains, every day thousands of children in our culture are verbally and physically abused, starved, tortured, and murdered. They are the true victims of intimate terrorism, in that they have no collective voice and no rights. They remain the property of parenting adults to do with as they will. What does Hooks mean when she says that children are property? And for this part, I'm going to depart from All About Love and give some recent data. So children have no voting rights. In the US, it's legal to hit your children. The US is the only UN country that hasn't ratified the Convention on Children's Rights, which bans physical and mental violence toward children. Courts have ruled in favor of parents who have beaten and bruised their children. In the US, it's illegal to hit your wife or kick your dog, but legal to beat your child with a wooden spoon. Every single day, 12 children die from gun violence in America. Another 32 are shot and injured. About 1 in 5 gay and lesbian youths have been threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. Children of color are far more susceptible to campus gun violence than their white counterparts. In general, children are more likely to be exposed to violence and crime than adults. Does this sound like a loving environment for children? Does it sound like a culture of justice? Young people don't understand love because they grow up in a culture of violence, fear, and injustice. This is what adults are teaching them to accept. Children can't vote for politicians who care about their interests. If they argue with their parents, they could be physically or mentally abused. They're oppressed in their public and private lives. They have the status of property. The oppression of children is something that the Ethical Society could help raise awareness about. The second reason love is so hard to find is greed. Just as injustice is incompatible with love, so is greed. In societies characterized by injustice, greed flourishes. Hooks writes, "Greed and exploitation become the norm when an ethic of domination prevails. They bring in their wake alienation and lovelessness." Hooks describes America as a culture of pathological narcissism, in which people value material things above love. This is why Americans feel alienated, cut off, alone, as well as depressed and desperate. According to the World Health Organization, the US is the richest country in the world, but also one of the most depressed. In 2016, the US ranked third for unipolar depressive disorders after China and India, 2 other leading economies. Why are rich countries so unhappy? In Hooks' words, materialism creates a world of narcissism in which the focus of life is solely on acquisition and consumption. A culture of narcissism is not a place where love can flourish. Hooks explains how America turned away from collectivism and embraced narcissism in the late 20th century. Prior to the Vietnam War, a hopeful vision of justice and love had been evoked by the civil rights struggle, the feminist movement, and sexual liberation. However, by the late 70s, after the failure of radical movements for social justice aimed at making the world a democratic, peaceful place where social resources could be shared and a meaningful life could become a possibility for everyone, folks stopped talking about love. The loss of lives at home and abroad had created economic plenty, while leaving in its wake devastation and loss. Americans were asked to sacrifice the vision of freedom, love, and justice, and put in its place the worship of materialism and money. This vision of society upheld the need for imperialistic war and injustice. A great feeling of despair gripped our nation when the leaders who had led struggles for peace, justice, and love were assassinated. Americans were in despair, but had more economic resources than ever. Their family lives were riven by trauma from the Vietnam War, Watergate, and a loss of faith in government and social institutions. Many families fell apart. In the wake of this devastation, Americans turned to a new Protestant work ethic and immersed themselves in their jobs, hoping to make as much money as possible. They turned away from community and connection and sought purpose and comfort in a hedonistic lifestyle. Americans started to believe that greed is good and that love and justice are inessential or even impossible. Instead of revering political activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, who had sacrificed everything, even their own lives, for equality and justice, they started to idolize people who were famous for being rich. As Hooks puts it, In keeping with this shift in values from a people-oriented to a thing-oriented society, the rich and famous, particularly movie stars and singers, began to be seen as the only relevant cultural icons. Gone were the visionary political leaders and activists. Movies, TV series, and songs continue to promote an ethic of greed by portraying wealth as inherently good, no matter how it is obtained. In fact, the mass media rarely tells us how rich people accumulate their wealth, but it's always by nefarious means. Reality TV shows like The Kardashians glamorize wealth, fame, and luxury, even though those things contribute nothing to a society worth living in. On the contrary, the lifestyles of the rich and famous are the leading cause of global injustice. The Kardashian clothing line, for example, comes from sweatshops that use child labor and force people to work in brutal conditions. In 2022 alone, Kim Kardashian's private jet emitted 4,268.5 tons of carbon emissions over 57 flights. That's 609.8 times more than the average person emits in a year. Overall, the richest 1% of people in the world produce more than double the carbon emissions of half the people on the planet. Why do we give money and attention to narcissistic hedonists who don't care about the least well-off? Hooks writes about the time she interviewed Lil' Kim, and when she asked her about love, the rapper replied that she had no interest in it. She only cared about money. This response was no doubt influenced by her traumatic childhood, which made her suspicious of love. But so many American icons hold the same opinion. They tell us that nothing matters more than prosperity. American religious institutions have gone down the same path. Christian churches, many of which had been active in the civil rights movement up to the 1970s, increasingly turn toward a gospel of prosperity. The prosperity gospel says that Christians will be rewarded with wealth and security, especially if they send money to their pastor. This trend has continued to the present day, with one American televangelist, Kenneth Copeland, having an estimated net worth of $770 million. Instead of sharing this wealth, Copeland evaded taxes on his $7 million mansion in 2022 by declaring it a clergy residence. He also evaded taxes on his private jet. In this culture of greed and lovelessness, addiction thrives. When people don't have their emotional needs met, they turn to drugs for comfort. Hooks says that addiction makes love impossible because it comes before relationships and community. Yet the very thing that leads to addiction is lack of love. Hence, addiction is both a consequence of widespread lovelessness and a cause. The way that our society has chosen to deal with addiction is also unloving and unjust. Using a controlled substance is illegal. If you're found to be in possession of illicit drugs, you can go to jail. In fact, 44.8%, or close to half of incarcerated Americans, are imprisoned for nonviolent drug offenses. Hooks emphasizes that these incarcerated Americans are just like us. How many of you have done recreational drugs in your lifetime, and yet you're not in prison? Could it be because of your wealth, your skin color, your postal code, your family background? Imprisonment is distinctly American. America has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and the prison population is disproportionately Black, Latinx, and Indigenous. That is, the U.S. continues to politically disenfranchise the most oppressed groups. According to the Sentencing Project, Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans. Because the U.S. did not ratify the UN Convention on Children's Rights, the U.S. is also the only country in the world to sentence children to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mass racial incarceration is a form of state-sanctioned violence, and it is not a loving approach to addiction, poverty, social unrest, or the many other effects of an unloving culture. Why are so many Americans behind bars? The answer, once again, is greed. American prisons are businesses. They generate over $74 billion a year and are funded by governments. Thousands of incarcerated Americans are forced to make consumer products, work at call centers, work in factory farms on work release programs, and do other types of labor for little to no pay. Your taxpayer dollars subsidize these business ventures. Over half of incarcerated Americans do in-house labor like cleaning, laundry, groundskeeping, maintenance, and custodial services for no income. Unpaid penal labor, also known as prison slavery, is legal in the United States because the 13th Amendment allows slavery as punishment for a crime. Yet, according to the ACLU, even pretrial detainees are forced to work for nothing in violation of the U.S. Constitution's lax prohibitions. Penal labor is profitable for corporations like CoreCivic and GEO Group, which own and run prisons and immigration detention centers. These corporations are currently facing lawsuits, alleging that they force prisoners to work against their wills while denying them basic necessities like adequate food, clothing, and health care. Incarcerated Americans do free labor for corporations like McDonald's, Starbucks, and Verizon. Decarceral feminists like Angela Davis describe America as a police state that uses policing and incarceration to make money. Imprisonment, she tells us, is not about punishment or deterrence or responsibility. It's about greed. It's about generating profits for corporations. America is a culture of pervasive and normalized violence. The media makes violence seem acceptable and heroic. Hooks writes, the mass media dwells on and perpetuates an ethic of domination and violence because our image makers have more intimate knowledge of these realities than they have with the realities of love. We all know what violence looks like. The top-grossing movie in the U.S. in 2023 was Top Gun: Maverick, a film about a U.S. Navy flight instructor who trains pilots to destroy an unsanctioned uranium enrichment plant. According to Wikipedia, the film features surface-to-air missiles, fifth-generation fighter Su-57s, as well as older F-14 Tomcats, 2 pairs of FA-18EF Super Hornets armed with laser-guided bombs, and other deadly weapons. Top Gun: Maverick is little more than an advertisement for the U.S. military. The movie received support from the Department of Defense, or DoD, in the form of equipment, including jets and aircraft carriers, personnel, and technical expertise, all of which was authorized by the DoD Entertainment Media Office of the U.S. military. In exchange for DoD backing, the producers agreed to let the department make changes to the script to make it even more favorable to the military. That is, the DoD censors military movies and refuses to fund movies that don't paint it in a positive light, making it virtually impossible to make movies that are not pro-military. Who else will lend filmmakers F-14 fighter jets? The CBC says that after World War II, Hollywood became the unofficial propaganda arm of the U.S. military, churning out high-budget nationalist propaganda that made war seem not only inevitable, but glamorous. Yet it wasn't until after the Vietnam War that the U.S. military embraced the notion of a national security state that should always be ready for war and therefore perpetually investing in guns, bombs, ballistic missiles, fighter jets, and nuclear weapons. Whereas every previous war had been followed by drastic military cuts, the Vietnam War ushered in an era of perpetual warfare and never-ending military spending. America spends by many orders of magnitude more on the military-industrial complex than any other nation. In fact, it spends more than the next 9 countries combined. The U.S. spends much more on defense than on education, Medicare, or transportation. Companies like Lockheed Martin make billions of dollars a year in sales from deals with governments all over the world, including the U.S., and their weapons have been used to kill children and innocent civilians. In order to justify this use of taxpayer dollars, the government must create a culture of fear and intimidation in which Americans believe that violence is necessary, unstoppable, and even heroic. A state of perpetual war, violence, and fear is not a loving environment. We need to spend less on the military if we want to cultivate love, and we need to stop paying for so much violent entertainment. So, what can we do to solve the problem of lovelessness? The government hasn't created a loving society. The family too often fails to foster love and acceptance. Corporations promote an ethic of greed, hedonism, and violence. What can we do to promote care, affection, recognition, respect, commitment, trust, and honest and open communication? I think that the members of the Ethical Society will like Hook's answer to this question. She says that community is a site of love and relationship building. Communities sustain life, not nuclear families or the couple, and certainly not the rugged individualists that corporations idolize. When we're abused and neglected by our governments, our employers, and our families of origin, we can turn to community to uplift and empower us. If our families reject us, we can find acceptance and validation in friendship. Loving friendships provide us with a space to experience the joy of community in a relationship where we learn to process all our issues, to cope with differences and conflict while staying connected. Communities are large and diverse and can take care of different people with different needs. This doesn't mean that there's never conflict within community. Realistically, being part of a loving community does not mean we will not face conflicts, betrayals, negative outcomes from positive actions, or bad things happening to good people. Love allows us to confront these negative realities in a manner that is life-affirming and life-enhancing. Love can mean showing compassion and forgiveness, or it can mean holding people accountable and calling people out. A loving community is caring and respectful, but doesn't tolerate unkindness from its members. Communities protect us from political violence. Hooks describes Martin Luther King Jr. as a prophet of love and quotes him as saying, "All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Dr. King used community to fight for racial justice and class equality. He shows us that community is a site of political organization and protest. Communities provide loving spaces for oppressed people. They're always the starting point for revolution. Communities are the only avenue to social change. Our community, the Ethical Society, can serve this purpose. It can be a safe haven for trans adults and children who are being attacked by Republican bills designed to persecute them. It can be a rallying point for abortion activists who believe that everybody has a right to essential health care, no matter their sex or gender. It can be a bulwark against the rising tide of white supremacy and fascism promoted by people like Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and Josh Hawley. It can be a place to celebrate a simpler life and learn to make do with less rather than mindlessly consuming crap that we don't need that comes from sweatshops and prison labor. It can be a site of advocacy for animals, children, and other groups that have no political voice. The Ethical Society can provide the community and friendship that we need to avoid loneliness, alienation, addiction, narcissism, and other effects of a loveless society. It can be a place to cultivate an ethic of love, to value people and relationships above money, status, and prestige. Thank you all for listening to that, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're from the Ethical Society, I will see you on Sunday.